Hello and welcome to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Blau. You're listening to Session 33. My guest today is Brian Mayer, a therapist practicing in Richmond, Virginia. Brian specializes in working with couples to help them develop deeper friendships, communicate in healthier ways, and manage conflict. Brian also works with his wife in a volunteer team approach known as marriage mentoring to help couples work through similar issues in the comfort of a home setting. He also leads support groups and workshops on such topics as divorce support, boundary setting, building relationships, and mindfulness for depression and anxiety. Prior to his career shift into couples therapy, Brian spent 20 years in the insurance and finance industry, including time at a Fortune 100 company in a management role. Brian is the past president of a local Toastmasters club, which helps people with public speaking, and he led workshops on teaching people public speaking and helping them learn healthier ways of communicating. Brian is the host of a brand new podcast called The Remarried Life. He interviews professionals and others on what it takes to build a healthy marriage and family for those who have experienced loss of a spouse through divorce or death. Here to give us his top tips on communication in the workplace, please welcome Brian Mayer. Hi, Brian. Welcome to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast. Thanks so much for being here. How are you?
Hey, Jen, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing here, and I'm happy to be on here today.
Well, thank you. So Brian is going to address a topic that, I think we all could use a little bit of help with. I have worked on teams that have been very cohesive and almost like a family. And then I've worked in places that the toxicity in the air is so thick you could cut it with a knife, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think this is a common problem. So Brian is here today to talk all about communication skills, and he's going to give us his top tips for resolving workplace conflicts. So Brian, what advice do you have for our listeners who think, oh my gosh, we could really use some good advice here?
Yeah, definitely. And, I think with what you're talking about how situations are so different, the environments can be so different, there's definitely, I think, a need for this, for a better communication, better conflict management, that type of thing. And so, yeah, and a lot of times I think we think about workplace conflict as not being normal, it's negative, but really, it's really all in how you deal with it, how you come through it, how you communicate with others. And so, again, just really about how we manage it, I think, is the most important thing. And I really love this study that was done about 10 years ago. It was by this company called CPP Global. They're the folks behind the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, is probably how most folks would know them. And they questioned, I think, about 5,000 people over 9 countries in Europe and the Americas on what their attitudes were about conflict. And maybe not so surprisingly, 85% of the workers said they deal with conflict. What I thought was surprising was that about a third of them said they have to do it always or frequently. And so that just kind of blew my mind, that statistic about how prevalent I think conflict and communication issues are in the workplace. And they ranked the United States, I think, if I remember right, the study ranked them third out of the 9 countries that they studied, saying that on an average, workers spend about 2.8 hours of conflict during the week. And unfortunately, those folks in Ireland and Germany, if you've got listeners there, they probably know a little bit more about this than we do over here in the States, but they were tied at first with 3.3 hours. And so just think about that, about how many hours per week is spent not working on projects, not handling customers, not, working with the animals that we've come to love. It's all about conflict and communication that we're having to deal with. And so one of the things that they said regarding the top causes for conflict, they said personality clashes were number 1, stress was number 2, and heavy workloads was number 3. And so again, think about number 1, personality clashes. So it's all about people. It's not about the work. And so again, one of those things where a lot of time and money are lost because of this. They talked about how many sick days were taken, even failed projects that can't get off the ground because people can't communicate properly. And then, ultimately people leave organizations when they can't communicate or when they can't resolve conflict. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the study is they asked people, well, who's responsible for this? And, in my mind, I'm thinking everybody's going to answer, well, it's the other guy. The other guy's the problem, not me. And the answer actually overwhelmingly was everyone. We all play a part in it. And so that kind of made me feel better that, hey, we've got all these problems, but at least folks say, you know what, we're all in this together. And so that's kind of a little bit of background, I think, to get us jump started and talking about those tips to help with communication and conflict resolution.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. So you mentioned there's kind of three factors involved in this. And so the first one is obvious, personality differences. So you throw a bunch of people in a room together, it's human nature, right? We're bound to have some conflict. And then so when you talk about the other two, when you're talking about the animal welfare field, you are talking about tremendous stress and pressure, because you're dealing with life and death all the time. And then also the amount of work. That's a very common complaint that I hear, not enough manpower, and there's always something to do. There's always animals that need help. The need for helping doesn't clock out at 5 o'clock.
Right.
So so all three of those elements are really present in the fields, in the workplace of a lot of my audience members. So.
Yeah, no doubt. And I was thinking about this before we got together today. And, when you think about folks that want to help animals, you think, oh, gosh, well, you're going to get into a field where you're just dealing with animals. They don't really talk back. They're not nasty to you. It's just going to be kumbaya. It's going to be a lot of fun. But,
Yeah.
But then we think about, well, you know what? There are other humans involved, unfortunately, sometimes. That causes a lot of stress. So no doubt about it. I think really no matter what field you're in, you're going to have to deal with this, and you just can't get away from it. So with that being said, we can just jump right in if you want to, Jen.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So really the kind of the way I think about, again, communication, conflict management, I kind of group it into three broad areas. And then I think within those three broad areas, I'll give you, I think, my best three tips to handle those specific areas. And I would say to these three broad areas, the importance of the order in which you take them is extremely important. And we'll start with your mindset. That's really the first part. And in science, they talk about this thing called neuroplasticity. And for a long time, folks felt like the brain was very rigid. It wasn't malleable. It wasn't changeable. But that all has changed with this research on neuroplasticity. And so, again, we can change the way we think, which is good and bad. So if we go into a situation sort of with a neutral opinion, and then we start to think negatively about it, those pathways of negativity get opened up, and then it just becomes easier and easier to get negative. And a lot of times I think about, say you're walking in a forest and you look, and normally there's that one beaten path that everybody's walked down, and you say, yep, that's the one I'm going to go down. A week later, you enter the same forest. There's that same path. Yep, I'm going to take that one. You might look around. You might see some other areas that you can go through, but it's a little overgrown, a little tougher. And you just decide, no, I'm not going to do that. And so, again, you take that same sort of negative path. And I think it's one of those things where changing or shifting the mindset, it is tough. It's not easy, but it is doable, and it takes practice. And so with that, let's get into sort of three ways to be able to change that mindset. So I think when it comes to dealing with others, a lot of times we do focus on that negative. So maybe they said something to us that just didn't sit very well with us. We can sit and stew upon that, or we can change our perspective and say, maybe dig a little bit into, well, I wonder what made them say that, or what's going on there. And you might remember that, hey, gosh, my coworker worked 12 hours yesterday, or gosh, they had a really tough customer this morning, or you know what, I remember they had a very sick daughter last week that they had to take a couple of days off. And so, maybe that's the reason for the negativity. And so I think, again, just sort of shifting our perspective and understanding that, people have lives and worlds outside of conversations with us that may be affecting them, I think is one thing that's very important.
So not taking it so personally.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing, again, that we all have lives, just like, I hope that I'm given the benefit of the doubt when I maybe slip up and say something negative. It's, we need to extend that to others, I think, is sort of our first response anyway. And then number two is we need to spend less time thinking about people and more time about ideas. And I saw this great quote recently, and I don't know if Jen, if you've heard this one, but it said something to the effect of great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. And so let me say that one more time. Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. And so with that, I think about what if somebody like a Thomas Jefferson spent all of his time thinking about somebody else, gossiping, whatever it might have been. Maybe the custodian didn't sweep the floor properly for him to be able to concentrate on his writing. What if he spent most of his time thinking about that? Or you think about somebody like Einstein, one of the most brilliant thinkers in history. What if he spent most of his time thinking about others rather than their ideas? I think, where would we be? And of course, we wouldn't have heard of them. And I don't think our country would be where it is today without them. So definitely something that I think we need to think about.
Yeah, we only have so much energy. And if our energy is going toward, like you said, kind of stewing about other people or gossiping or backstabbing, then that's less energy we have for actual productive work, such as helping animals.
Yep, no doubt about it. And the third one within sort of changing the mindset is what I call mindfulness meditation. And again, I think a lot of people have preconceived notions about meditation. This isn't really your typical meditation. And I wanted to say I really enjoyed your episode. I think it was just a few episodes back. You did like a 3-week series from what I remember. And I loved some of the mindfulness techniques that you talked about.
Yeah, so that was not only was it a little stress management mini series, but really all three of those shows had elements of mindfulness in them. So can you expand on how mindfulness can help with communicating with others?
Yeah, definitely. So, again, as your listeners probably know, mindfulness is really all about kind of distancing ourselves from our thoughts, not getting wrapped up in our thoughts, realizing that they are our opinions. They're not necessarily facts, and just seeing them for what they are and allowing them to move through. And one thing I heard somebody say about mindfulness is it's almost like every time that you see a thought and that you move away from it, kind of return back to your breathing, things like that. It's almost like you're doing a bicep curl for your brain. And so, again, I think by doing those things, it really, I do it in the morning. And so when I come into work, I'm definitely not as agitated or not as, on alert for, if somebody says something that I don't feel like is exactly the way I would have wanted to hear it worded. When I do that mindfulness again, it's almost like a peace and a calm that comes over me, that where it almost just kind of just reflects back off of me rather than me absorbing it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like what you said about every time you do that, you practice that mindfulness, it's like a bicep curl for your brain. I like that.
Yeah, definitely. I know that's something that's always stuck with me. And it's like, who doesn't want to get stronger? We all want to get stronger in our body, but we definitely need to get stronger in our mind as well. So
Definitely, definitely.
So that's all about your mindset. So again, I feel like that's number one. That's probably most important. That will set the stage for these last two. And so I'll get into the second one, and that's really listening. And again, that's just an extension, just like we talked about, of the mindfulness attitude, and staying in the present moment. And another interesting research study that I saw, I think it was back in the 60s, where they talked about there's 3 things that really come out of conversation with somebody, 3 things that we actually remember or that stick with us. And those 3 things are body language, tone, and words. And the interesting thing about those 3 is they discovered that actually body language accounts for more weight than tone and words combined. They said that 55% of what people remember from somebody is the body language, and it's 45% is tone and words. And so that almost just seems kind of flipped from what I think you would think typically. And so, but it's all about how we present ourselves to others without even saying a word. That's important. So, I like to talk to people about, simply mirroring other people's facial expressions can go a long way. If somebody's smiling, you smile back, or if they laugh, tell a funny joke, you're laughing with them. If they show some sadness, you show sadness right back to them. And so that goes a long way in connecting with others. And I was just thinking about a meeting I think I was at a couple of years ago where I had told a joke at some point. It was an appropriate point to tell a joke. We had been working pretty hard and pretty long. And I think there were 4 or 5 folks in the room, and 3 or 4 of them laughed. And there was one individual that I looked at that didn't laugh. And so my immediate thought was, wow, you know, he didn't find that very funny. But ultimately, it could have been that maybe he was just having a tough day, or maybe his thoughts were elsewhere. So, but again, it's all about what I assumed up front based upon what he did. And so, again, if we can simply mirror what other people are showing us, it definitely goes a long way, I think, in connecting with other people.
And what's interesting is it sounds like you also in that moment kind of discounted the 3 or 4 people that did laugh with you and kind of honed in on the one guy who didn't. So the one negative experience.
That's true. That's true. You're right. I think you kind of pointed out something that maybe before I had learned about mindfulness and changing my mindset that, yeah, I got myself caught up in, no doubt about it. And the second one within the listening, I think, is again, just being fully present. And that really means just engaging in what the other person's saying. So you're really putting off your worry about a future project, putting off something negative that maybe a customer said to you in the morning, and you're really concentrating on that current conversation. And then a funny thing is that studies have actually shown that your charisma actually increases in the eyes of that other person when you're simply being present. Again, when you're mirroring their facial expressions, or when you're commenting and saying things like, wow, tell me more, gosh, didn't know that. Even simple things like that, again, just increases how other people view you. So I think that's very important. Again, just being fully present and using that body language like we talked before. And then the third one, I like to call this one watching a movie. And no, I don't necessarily mean that, when somebody wants to have a conversation, you say, excuse me, I'm going to dismiss myself and watch a movie on YouTube. I actually mean, actually watch them like a movie. So if you think about your favorite movie or television show, let's just say there was a killer and you're trying to figure out who did it and what happened. In your mind, you've got questions trying to answer, like, what's going on here? I wonder why he did that. What did he say there? Oh yeah, I remember, earlier in the movie, he said this. Now this makes sense. And I say the same thing that this is how we should be talking to others. We should be, or at least thinking about others, I should say, and that we just need to think about them as if we're watching a movie. So again, it's not so much of like somebody says something and we think, gosh, what a jerk, or, what an idiot. It's more about, no, let me get more information here. Let me see if I can really hone in on what they're saying, what they have said, the perspective, the big picture, that type of thing. Because that's what we do in a movie. We really want more information, and so that's really what that's all about. So that's really some 3 good tips about really how to be a good listener.
So I want to just kind of go back to something that you touched on earlier with the body language. So what else so when we're talking about body language, I know that, if you have your arms crossed type of thing, that's going to almost give out I'm really not interested in what you're saying type of vibe, right? Are there other types of things that we do with our body that can maybe give off not so much negative energy, but just a certain vibe that we're really not interested? Or, can you just give us some tips on, I guess, some healthy body language?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you make a very good point about the arms being crossed. And I like to say to people, the neutral position is really the best position. So if you're standing, your arms are down at your side. And I know as your listeners are thinking about that, and even as I think about that, sometimes that doesn't feel right, or that doesn't feel comfortable. But I like to tell people, it's really not about how you feel. It's about how you're coming across. And so again, that neutral position is good. But getting back to what you're saying about, are there some negatives? I like to think about, some of your listeners may remember, I think it was during a debate back in the 80s, George Bush Sr. happened to look at his watch during a critical questioning moment. And so he just got destroyed for that. It was one of those things where it may have just been just out of habit. He probably, how we look at our watch or we look at our phone, sometimes we don't even really pay attention to what we're doing. It's just like a reflex. And that may have been the case for him, but he just got blasted, like what does he want to leave? Is he bored? That type of thing. So it could even be little things like that we should become aware of. Just again, just simple little habits, or even like a yawn. I've gotten myself to be very careful about yawning in meetings because it comes across as, you're disinterested, you don't care, you're bored. But again, it may have everything to do with the fact that maybe I only slept 3 hours the night before. But again, it's more about how you come across.
You might get into this, so I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun here, but are you familiar with John Gottman's Four Horsemen?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so can you touch on maybe, so one of those horsemen is contempt, which has a lot of body language in it, negative body language. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about contempt and how we can avoid coming across that way?
So yeah, when it comes to John Gottman and what he talks about with contempt, there's no doubt about it. There's name calling, there's mocking, but there's also eye rolling. And so definitely those are some of the things that we don't even really think about. We don't think about how they come across to other people. In our minds, it might just be, again, a reflex, or maybe it makes us feel better to roll our eyes. But again, what that says to the other individual is, wow, you're just not very important. And I am. And that's the way that comes across. So yeah, contempt is just one of those huge, like you said, four horsemen that he talks about. I think he even talks about that being the worst one.
Oh, yeah. And, so before we move on, could you touch on, because for those listeners who might not know, John, and we did talk about this in an episode about relationships, intimate relationships, but John Gottman has studied communication styles basically and has nailed down 4 types that predict divorce rates. And so, but I like to think that these types of communication styles can really have a negative effect on any type of relationship. So, Brian, would you mind touching on the other 3, just so our listeners know what to kind of look out for?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I would definitely love to do that. So, and just again, the four horsemen of the apocalypse is kind of what he called them. And so it really, in the Bible, that spells the end of days. And so with what he talks about with relationships, it really spells the demise of the relationship. And I think he did studies where he could actually predict divorce or relationship demise occurring, like I think it was over 90% of the time when these 4 things are present, with frequency and with severity. And so, yeah, let me talk about the other 3. So again, we talked about contempt. Another one is criticism. And this is really where you're getting away from the issue at hand, and it's really become more about an attack on the person. And so, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this with our next section with what we've been talking about with communication. But again, it's more about how you're not sticking with the issue. So let's take, washing dishes, for example. Let's say, my wife asked me if I would do the dishes last night at 9 o'clock. Well, she wakes up this morning, sees the dishes aren't done. Rather than talking to me about the dishes, a criticism might be something like, well, you never do the dishes like I asked you to do. You're lazy. You're always doing this, that type of thing, where again, you're moving away from the issue at hand, and you've kind of turned it into an attack on the person. So that's criticism. That's number 1. Another one is defensiveness. And this one's probably in my work with couples. This is the one that I see the most often, and it probably would, I think, span across all relationships. But what defensiveness is where you are not taking responsibility for what happened. So let's go back to the dishwashing sort of scenario. So in that case, again, my wife might say something to me about the dishes not being done. Well, defensiveness, I'm going to probably do one of 2 things. I'm either going to be an innocent victim and say something like, well, gosh, I've just been really stressed. I've had a lot to do. There was a lot going on. My dad called last night. That conversation took an hour. I just didn't have time. Again, where you're kind of diverting the attention, if you will. Another way to be defensive is you can actually turn it around as an attack on the other person. So let's say that maybe my wife was supposed to sweep the floors yesterday morning and she didn't do it. I might say something like, well, you know what? I was going to wash the dishes last night, but I saw that you hadn't done the floors yet. And so I said, why bother? And so again, that's just another way to be defensive. And what Gottman says is just take a little bit of responsibility. That's all you have to do. Sometimes you don't have to be 100% responsible for something, but saying something as simple as, you know what? Yep, last night at 9 o'clock, I said I was going to wash the dishes and I didn't do it. Let me get on that. If you can do that, that goes a long way in connecting with an individual and making them feel heard and understood. And again, that's something we'll talk about as well. And then the last one that I'll talk about, it's called stonewalling. And this kind of goes into more about the body language discussion that we just had. Stonewalling is where you are just overwhelmed to the point of you're still there, you're physically present, but you have mentally checked yourself out. It's almost like you just can't handle anymore. You don't know what to do, so you just really just freeze up. And the funny thing about what Gottman says about stonewalling is that, I don't know if it's necessarily funny, but 85% of the time males actually stonewall. And so, think back to some conversations you've had, but for whatever reason, they're more genetically prone to, again, just sort of shut it down and, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to say here. So I'm just going to be quiet and maybe I won't make it worse. And, what he says about stonewalling is you just take a time out. You just say to the person, look, I just need some time. I'm overwhelmed right now. I'm really upset. Give me a half an hour. I'll come back. And then I tell people, if at the end of a half an hour, if you come back and you're still not feeling right, say, can I have another half an hour? And then, keep doing that as long as you need to do it. But ultimately come back and try to finish the conversation. So yeah, those four horsemen are definitely huge, very important to get a handle on.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, they're beneficial in intimate relationships, but I really think that they span across all different types of relationships, including at work.
Yep, no doubt about it. Yeah, I think, and we think about how many hours we spend per day and per week at work. Yeah, these things are huge and they're important. And so, yeah, I think we need to definitely pay attention to them.
Okay, great. So, Brian, what is the third and final area?
Yeah, so the third area is speaking, and again, just like I said before, we're going in order of importance, or maybe not importance, but just there's a logical order here. So again, we talked about mindset, and then we talked about listening, and now the final thing is speaking. So once you've got your mindset and your listening squared away, now you're ready to speak. And so I think really the most important thing there is simply just hearing and understanding someone. So we as human beings, a lot of time we feel like we've either got to problem solve, we've got to give advice, or we've got to, defend our position like we talked about earlier. But simply hearing someone, understanding them is huge. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, simply, again, understanding, hearing what they said, being fully present. But one way that they can feel understood and heard is you summarize what you just heard them say. So it could be something as simple as, well, let me give you this example. Let's say I'm at work. I go out to lunch. It ran a little bit long. I come back to the office or the practice, and somebody immediately says, "What time is it?" Well, in my mind, I might take that as an attack. Oh, I'm walking in late. Somebody's asking me what time it is. They must be mad at me, and so I'm ready. I've got my ammunition. I'm ready to fire back. Well, what if instead of firing back, what if I said something like, "Oh, you need to know what time it is. Is that what you said?" They might say, "Yeah, for some reason I've lost my watch. The clock battery is dead in here. I'm running behind on something I'm working on. Can you let me know what time it is? I see you've got a watch on." Oh, sure. It's 1:15. And then you kind of go on your way and nothing really happens. So by me summarizing what I just heard or asking some questions rather than again ready to attack, I really diffused an argument that didn't need to happen. And so that's very important. And a lot of times I call it the fast food drive method. That might be another way to remember it. So, think about this. The next time you go to a fast food drive through, you order your food. So you say, "I want a cheeseburger, a large fries, and a large soda." And what's the first thing that they typically do after you order? Well, they actually repeat your order back. And so they might say, "So you wanted a bacon cheeseburger, small fries, and a small soda?" And then, of course, you say, "No, that's not what I needed." And then you repeat back what you wanted. And then they repeat back. And then at that point, you say, "Yep, that's exactly what I needed." And so I think in conversations, it kind of goes the same way. I think really truly understanding what somebody's saying and trying to get across is very important because we can definitely take it all sorts of different ways. So number 2 on the list of how we should speak to others is really just providing empathy. And a lot of people don't really know exactly what that means. I think probably in the animal welfare industry and the other mental health fields, I think people have a little bit more of an understanding of that, but I'll still go over it nonetheless. But that's really where you're you're not necessarily, it doesn't mean you're necessarily agreeing with what somebody's saying, but empathy just means, you know what, under these conditions, based upon what you're telling me, gosh, I can see how you would feel that way. So again, maybe it's a situation where, a customer or client calls into the office and just goes through the roof. And now you've got a coworker that's just highly upset and needs to talk to you. And they come to you, talk over the situation. And in your mind, you're thinking, well, gosh, I agree with the client or I agree with the customer here. Empathy is not saying I agree with you. It's just simply saying, you know what? The way that customer acted, the way they yelled at you, gosh, I can see how much that would upset you. That really stinks, that kind of thing. Again, and so I think a lot of times folks think that, oh gosh, I can't give any kind of empathy because that comes across as I'm agreeing with what they're saying, and that's not the case at all. And but I think that's still important, empathy. And then the third and final piece I think that's important when it comes to speaking is, and this kind of goes back a little bit to the four horsemen as well, but when you're ready to give your perspective, again, talking about or thinking about the dishwashing incident, saying things like "I feel." So, my wife, instead of attacking me about not doing the dishes and how I'm always lazy, she might say something like, I feel really alone and upset when the dishes aren't done in the morning. And then from there, she needs to state a positive need, something that she needs from me. Because again, the logical sort of thought process is after you say something like that is then you want to again tell the person what you need them to stop doing, you definitely need to have them stop doing something. But if you say that way, it really closes people off. It really sort of shuts people off to listening. And so by phrasing something as a positive need, it really opens people's ears up, I think, to be able to hear. So in this example, again, she might say something like, I feel really upset and alone when you don't do the housework. We're a team here. I need you to do the dishes at 9:00, like you said you would do. And again, that's a positive need. So again, it's not saying, again, what you're not doing, which closes people off, but it's saying, this is what I need. And again, I think that will go a long way to, again, being connected with others and having those better conversations. So, and with that, those are really, Jen, those are my, I think, big three areas. Again, change of mindset, listening and speaking, and just hopefully those are some helpful tips to really, I think, help these conversations and these relationships move along and definitely some high stress environments.
So, Brian, that sounds great. And it sounds like a lot of this, you mentioned who's responsible, and the answer is everyone, right? So we start with ourselves. We start with our mindset and our listening skills, and then our, overall, and then our speaking skills. What if we are working on ourselves and we still notice that, maybe there's still some backstabbing, some gossiping going on. Maybe there's a workplace bully that we're trying to deal with. What do we do if all else fails and we've worked on our own communication skills, but maybe other people aren't responding? What are we supposed to do at that point?
Yeah, that's really tough. Yeah, because like you said, it's like we can spend all this time working on ourselves, learning some of these tools and techniques, and then you got somebody on the other end that just continues to sabotage, and it's not going the way you want it to go. And so it's tough. But I would recommend the first thing is really going to that person. And again, I know there's in some instances that's tough because maybe your listeners have gone to that person and it hasn't worked well. But that's really the first step, I think, is going to that person. And I'll give you an example. 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in the business world, had a situation with a coworker, and I kind of lost it, to be, really brutally frank, and over some things I think that had been stewing for quite a while, but I lost it over one little piece of the puzzle, and, over things that happened again over months and over years. And I had just kind of let them build inside of me. And then, like I said, just kind of blew my top. And, for a couple of weeks, I just sat there and stewed on it. And I couldn't get this person out of my mind, as from a, just not really liking them very well, and kind of had this thought of, and I heard this great quote somewhere that said something to the effect of, if you're going to allow someone to remain in your mind like that for however long, you're actually letting them set up shop rent free in your mind. And so that really kind of spoke to me and said, wow, I can't allow this to go on any longer. I can't stew on this. I have to go to this person. And so I just started with the thing that I had done wrong. I didn't start at all with anything about what they had done. I simply started with, you know what, the other day when I blew my lid, that was wrong with me. I should not have done that. And then, it seemed to really ease the tension. It brought kind of the stress and the pressure, I think, in the air way down. And then we were able to have a rational conversation. And then at that point, I did bring up some things that were hurtful to me in the past. And again, I apologized by saying, you know what, when those things came up, I didn't bring them up at that time and I should have. And so that was my fault as well. So again, I know sometimes that may sound like, gosh, are you just taking much more of the blame than you really should? No, I don't think so. I was, asking for forgiveness, taking that blame for everything that I had done wrong. And then, again, I think it opened up the conversation a little bit more. So I think that's at least one way I think that folks can at least give that a try to help anyway.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, Brian, how can learning more effective communication skills, how can this help to reduce overall workplace stress as well as compassion fatigue?
Yeah, definitely. I think it goes along with what I was just saying about, when we keep things kind of bottled up, we sort of, proverbially brush things under the rug. It's not good. We need to be able to communicate, but in a kind and caring way so that other people will hear us. Again, we don't want to have the pendulum swing too far one way or the other, where again, we're not saying anything, we're keeping things bottled up, but then at the same time, we don't want to be completely shooting off the hip as well. There needs to be a balance and a management of that. And so I think, again, just by utilizing a lot of these techniques we talked about and by being able to have frank conversations in a calm manner, I think really will go a long way to helping reduce burnout and that compassion fatigue that you talk about.
Great advice. Brian, is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners today?
I think probably the only other thing that I would say, again, just like we talked about earlier, that it does take two people. There's no doubt about it, and it's hard because people will tend to sabotage sometimes our positive methods of communication. But we just need to keep at it, stay the course, keep practicing these things. A lot of times they'll feel awkward in the beginning when you're trying to change the way you communicate. But I think as long as you keep with them, eventually it's going to become ingrained. It's going to become more normal and natural for you.
So how can people learn more about you and what you do?
Yeah, definitely. So people, I think probably the two best ways to contact me would be through my two websites. My first one is for my therapy practice. It's brianmayertherapist.com. Or they can also reach me. I've got an exciting new venture called The Remarried Life, where I have a podcast where I help people that are thinking about love again, or that may have entered into another marriage and to where they need some tips and advice and help. And I'll have a lot of great experts on. So I've got a podcast that people might want to check out. And they can also go to the website. It's theremarriedlife.com. And so this would be the best ways to get a hold of me.
Wonderful. How exciting. Congratulations on the new podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Exciting. So I will go ahead and put both of those links up on the show notes page at thecompassionfatiguepodcast.com. So if you all would like to check out Brian's resources and learn more about him and maybe get in touch, you can head on over there and click on those links. Well, Brian, thanks so much for taking the time out today to have this discussion with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jen. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun.
All right. Take care, Brian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. Please remember to head on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so you never miss a single episode. And don't forget to check out thecompassionfatiguepodcast.com for more great resources. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you need additional support. And if you are feeling suicidal, please go to your nearest emergency room or call 911.